It was called the Edgar Meeting House. And it was located on a beautiful ridge. I can still see the men felling the trees, shaping the timbers with their broadaxes, and placing the timbers one by one on top of each other. Our own temple of worship in the wilderness. And we were far and away from Ireland, and far away enough from those colonial authorities at Charlestown.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are featuring Robert Ryals, our friend, public historian, and reenactor, as he presents at the Native American Studies Center at the University of South Carolina-Lancaster on the wartime experiences of Reverend William Martin.
Today I'm delighted. I think I'm going out in style because today we have Robert Ryals, who's a public historian and a reenactor. You see him over here to my left. He's ready to go. We're going to take a trip back into the 18th century to see the revolution through the eyes of a preacher. I need to tell you that this program is sponsored by the South Carolina American Revolution Sesquicentennial Commission. We know it easier as the SC250, established by the South Carolina legislature to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War era, highlighting the state's significant role in securing America's freedom by engaging and inspiring South Carolinians and visitors like you through heritage tourism, rural economic impact initiatives, and educational programs like we'll see today. Robert Ryals is a public historian. He's an active member of the Lancaster and York County SC250 committees, educated and engaged in the general public as a lecturer, historical interpreter, reenactor, and performer over 20 years at various historic sites, museums, and organizations across the southeastern United States. He has master's degrees in both history and information studies from Florida State University, has held professional positions as curator, reference librarian, archivist, and adjunct professor at Florida State University and at Winthrop University here nearby. So without further ado, I give you Robert Ryals.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Very good. And thank you, Chris, for that kind introduction. Appreciate that. I thank you and the staff here at the Native American Studies Center for hosting me as a guest speaker for the Lunch and Learn series. I also thank the Lancaster County SC250 Committee for their promotional support of the program. In fact, we have some members of the Lancaster County Committee here today. Kip Carter, and then of course, Miles Gardner in the back. Anyone else? Yes, John Rutledge as well. Thank you so much for your support. And also my thanks to the SC250 Commission itself for sponsoring the grant to help make this program a reality and for promoting the program as well. But most importantly, I thank y'all. Thank you all for coming today, showing your interest in the American Revolution as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the war in South Carolina. These programs wouldn't be possible without your interest and support. So thank you. So to start, I think it's really important to point out that the American Revolution was an epic struggle, really a huge story, and it just wasn't about battles. Sure, battles played an important part of that story, obviously, but it's the people that play the starring role in this epic. It's filled with all kinds of characters, some who are famous, like the generals, field people, politicians, some infamous, like Bloody Bill Cunningham, Thomas Fletchel, and others, and then, of course, the obscure. And the common thread shared by all these characters is that the war created an upheaval in all of their lives. This included free and enslaved men, women, Catawba, Cherokee, partisan patriots, loyalists, wealthy and poor. And sometimes the stories of the people involved in this epic struggle paid a heavy price based on the consequences of their own actions. And this included leading voices of dissent who stood on moral principle and conviction. Of course, in this case, I'm talking about Reverend William Martin, a Presbyterian man of the cloth who lived in the area of Rocky Creek, not far from present-day Great Falls. So, why did I choose Martin as a subject for an educational program? Well, there are three basic reasons. The first two are rather simple and short, but the third reason is a little bit more long and complex. The first reason, Martin's story is unique. There are many stories out there from the Revolution about, again, the exploits and failures of the famous generals, heroes, villains. But how often do you hear a story from the perspective of a clergyman? Not that often. The second reason is that Martin's story serves as an example of the immigration experience of a persecuted and marginalized group of people from Europe seeking opportunity and freedom in America. And this immigration story is basically a case study, in some respects, of that 18th century immigration of the Scots-Irish to America. Now, here's the third reason, and this is the one that's going to be a little bit more complex, and you're going to have to bear with me on this one, because this is important context for understanding the story. Martin's story helps to answer a why question, a why question. Over several years in my experience as a public historian in the Carolinas, I've heard some broad and some sweeping generalizations about the character of the Scotch-Irish and their culture. Things like Scotch-Irish were born to fight. They would fight at the drop of a hat. They've been characterized as a people that insulated themselves within their own communities and harboring long distrust for English institutions such as the Anglican Church, the English monarchy, and the English Parliament. But the thing is, I've never really heard any of my fellow public historians provide a thorough answer or explanation about why. And Martin's story helps to frame that answer. And again, this is where we dive into the long answer of why it may, and this may seem a bit long, but it's important background information. Now, as I just mentioned, Martin was a Presbyterian man of the cloth, but not just any Presbyterian man of the cloth. He was a Covenenter. The Covenanters were a radical sect of Presbyterians in Scotland who had been politically, culturally, and socially marginalized and persecuted by the English beginning in the 17th century. Yes, that long ago. They were called Covenanters because of their passionate and stubborn support of a loyalty oath they made in the 17th century called the National Covenant of 1638. In short, the National Covenant was a nationwide compact signed by thousands of Scots at a time when the Church of Scotland was under attack, and these Scots swore to defend the Church of Scotland against religious reforms that were forced upon them by Anglican bishops and encouraged by the English monarch, King Charles I. The Scots were concerned about control of the governance and the liturgical practices of the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church. Now, at the same time, there was a movement among the Covenanters, both religious and political, because it was a national political movement which united much of Lower Scotland against King Charles I, a common so-called enemy to rally behind, even though King Charles I was, by technicality, both King of England and King of Scotland. That's how popular he was among both Scots and English, by the way. Now, the politics are rather complicated, but bear with me. The Covenenter movement represented a time when the Scots were also asserting their self-determination and independence from these English institutions. And as a result, Covenenter political leaders in the Scottish Parliament were forced to forge a political alliance with members of the English Parliament, who had also opposed Charles I's oppressive measures, which led to a series of disagreements between the monarchy and the Parliament. And that was simply because Charles was overstepping his authority as a monarch. So what was the result of this? 17th century. We have the English Civil War. And the Covenanters in the Scottish Parliament struck a political agreement, or perhaps a corrupt bargain, with the English parliamentarians who opposed Charles I. And this bargain was also known as the Solemn League and Covenant of 1642. In this agreement, the English parliamentarians promised to diminish the Anglican Church's influence and meddling in the affairs of the Church of Scotland, and that they would grant the Scottish Parliament greater autonomy. Now, in exchange for that loyalty, the Covenanters promised to provide support to those English parliamentarians by not interfering with their plans to overthrow Charles I. And this was an important concession. And why is that? Because, again, Charles I was technically, by birthright, King of England and King of Scotland. So their position in siding with the English Parliament made the Covenanters traitors against both kingdoms. And as a result of this alliance, the anti-monarchy leaders in the English Parliament got the upper hand. They overthrew Charles I, and by the way, had him executed in 1649, the only English monarch to lose his head, literally. And it was a bargain that paid off, or so the Covenanters thought. Because what happened afterward was the English Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, and the monarchical institutions were essentially eliminated during that time. However, that interregnum period failed, and as a consequence, the monarchy was restored under whom? Charles's son, Charles II, in 1660. And in this case, the son soon sought vengeance for the death of the father and all of the father's political enemies. And this is when the Covenanters became targets. Their act of treason against the monarchy gave Charles II the legal justification to force them into compliance. And like his father before him, Charles II imposed very strict controls and passed decrees mandating the use of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer and other liturgical practices on the Presbyterian Church. Charles also required an oath of loyalty to the monarch, requiring all Presbyterian ministers to be completely deferential and subservient to Anglican practices. Refusing to do so was considered an act of treason. What did the Covenanters do? They simply ignored these strict measures. They fled to the Scottish countryside and practiced their faith in secret societies known as conventicles. And this led to a particularly dark period in Scottish history known as the Killing Time. From 1660 to 1688, an estimated 18,000 Covenanters were either imprisoned, tortured, killed, or banished to the American colonies and Northern Ireland, then known as Ulster. Now, eventually, stability would be restored throughout the realm, beginning with the 1689 Act of Toleration under King William III. And then religious toleration, again, toleration, was essentially guaranteed with the 1707 Act of Union. Under this act, both the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England were merged to form the Kingdom of Great Britain. And as part of that concession, other religious faiths, which included the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian faith, were regarded as tolerated faiths, not the official religion of Great Britain, tolerated faiths. There's a big difference. Now, many but not all Presbyterians were exhausted by the aftermath of Charles II's policies and those of his successors up until William III. And they saw the Act of Toleration and the Act of Union as a concession that led to peace and harmony. However, the Covenanters upheld their political and religious convictions and took seriously their oaths of loyalty to the national covenant. And this was a transference from generation to generation, well into the 18th century. Okay, so no doubt right now many of you are thinking, okay, when is this guy going to shut up and get with the program? I came here to learn about Reverend Martin. I get that. And this is where Martin's story comes into play. Unfortunately, Martin never kept a diary or journal. If he did, then it's been lost to history. However, we have a biographical snapshot and some details of Martin's early life and career in Ulster and his immigration experience, thanks to Jean Stevenson, a 20th century genealogist and historian. Her published work, titled Scots-Irish Migration to South Carolina, 1772, includes a really good sketch of Martin's life in Ireland. It also includes an exhaustive list of immigrants that accompanied him, which has become a valuable resource for genealogists tracing their family lineage from South Carolina back to the mother country. Martin was born in the year 1732 in County Antrim in Ulster into a Covenanter family. He was educated at Glasgow and moved back to Ireland to become the first minister of the Covenenter Presbyterians in Ulster, and it's where he spent several years of his youth shoring up the small Covenanter societies that had fled there. And his work yielded success. Then in 1772, Martin led an entourage of 467 families. That's about 1,000 Ulster Scots, to leave the various townships of Ballymoney, Ballymena, Kelswater, and Voe in County Antrim, and they migrated to South Carolina. And this is one of many examples of the 18th century Great Migration that took place during that time. Thousands of Scots-Irish Presbyterians fled from economic distress, rack renting, and religious restrictions in pursuit of opportunity in the American colonies. And Stevenson traces Martin's life to South Carolina. And then another historian, female historian, whose name was Elizabeth Elliott, picked up on Martin's story during the American Revolution. Elliott compiled a 3-volume anthology of oral traditions, family stories, and legends from women whose parents or grandparents lived during the Revolutionary era. This anthology is titled The Women of the Revolution, and Martin's story is published in volume 3 by a contributor whose name was Nancy Green, who was a descendant of one of the immigrants, part of Martin's entourage. Now, some of Elliott's accounts may border a bit on myth-making, but she deserves a lot of credit. She was giving women a voice in the 19th century when women really didn't have much of a voice, especially in a male-dominated field such as history. And the same credit goes to Stevenson as well for her role in a male-dominated academic field. So what I'm going to present to you today is a storytelling experience that was inspired by Stevenson's historical work and Ellet's oral tradition. And it's going to form a creative, dramatic narrative. And we'll have some time at the end of the program to answer any questions you may have. So now, let us turn to Reverend Martin so that he can share his story. October 4th, 1772, the day we left Ireland. There was a cold chill in the air, but our hearts were filled with hope for a new life in South Carolina. My wife Jeanette, daughter Nancy, and I were huddled together near the pier, taking in the view of the busy port at Larne. Members of my congregation were there as well in great numbers. Families huddled together, shivering in the cold. The James and Mary had already sailed on the 25th of August, and we were next. After many delays, the crew of the Lord Dunluce was making the final preparations for the long voyage across the Atlantic. It was the largest of our small fleet of 5 ships, a 400-ton transport vessel that we would soon board once food and supplies were safely stowed and secured. The wait was long and I grew impatient. And with nothing to do, I sat down and lost myself in my thoughts. We were leaving Ireland, our homeland, with the prospect of never seeing it again. My youth had been spent there, family memories, good and bad, and leaving behind the graves and final resting places of those from our own families and those in my flock. My thoughts turned to my years spent in seminary at Glasgow and my mentor, Reverend John Macmillan, and then they turned to the date of July 2nd, 1757, and my ordination at Vaux. That was a solemn occasion, but one of the most proud moments of my life. I was the first minister of the Reformed Church of the Covenenter sect in Ireland. And I spent the next 15 years of my life toiling in the fields of the Lord, sowing the seeds of our covenanting faith, growing our fledgling societies and cultivating them into churches, and finally reaping the harvest with 2 congregational districts. But our social order in Ireland was in great peril. And it wasn't just for the Covenanters. All Ulster Scots were in deep, troubled waters. Many hoped that Ulster would be a land of opportunity, but instead it turned into a land of struggle, poverty, and gloom. Many had settled on tenant lands owned by greedy British landlords and forced to pay high tenant rents. And the clutches of the Church of England only complicated our problems. Presbyterians and all other dissenting Protestant faiths were subjected to pay an annual tithe and a parish tax to support the Church of England. This was true whether we were members or not. And this included the poorest of the poor, Anglicans, even Catholics. And for what purpose? To line the pockets of greedy Anglican bishops with more gold and silver to pay their stipends and to pay for the upkeep of their own churches. Our expense, their church. And then the tenant rents increased, and evictions and destitution soon followed. Homeless families became roving bands of the destitute, wandering the countryside like gypsies. In 1972, I received a call for a pastoral position in the backcountry of South Carolina. It was at Catholic Presbyterian. I met with some colonial agents in Ireland and learned that South Carolina indeed offered a very generous land bounty under the headright system. 100 acres of free land to the head of a family, and another 50 for each member of his family. No tenant rents. The opportunity to own land, not rent it, and the freedom to worship as we pleased, as Covenanters. We turned our faces to the west, to the distant shores of America, and saw a new promised land. And I persuaded many in my congregation to join us in a mass exodus to this new land so far and away. We made the necessary preparation, pooled our resources to pay the expense of the voyage, and we commissioned 5 ships: the Lord Dunluce, the Hopewell, the Pennsylvania Farmer, the Freemason, and the James and Mary. And then my thoughts were interrupted. My wife Jeanette put her hand on my shoulder, and it was time to board. As we shuffled on board, I turned my head towards the distant sea. And after boarding, we spent the next hour making the final preparations for departure. And finally, the time had come. The ship let loose its moorings, and the ship slowly moved from the pier and into the open bay. And in the next hour, we made our way for the open sea. I was still topside, taking in the fresh salt air, and the fair wind was at our backs. The Holy Spirit was guiding us along. And then I turned my head back and looked towards the hind of the ship, and my native homeland began to shrink in the distance, slowly disappearing and then fading completely from sight on the distant horizon. Over 1,000 souls on that voyage, 460 families total, and our trip had a number of challenges. The voyage could take anywhere from 6 to 9 weeks, depending on the favoring winds and God's providence of deliverance from harsh storms. Life below decks was cramped, the light dim, the air thick with the smells of unwashed bodies and spoiled provisions. Those unaccustomed to life at sea and its foul conditions became sick. Food was basic and monotonous: salted beef or pork, hardtack biscuits often infested with weevils, dried peas and oatmeal. Fresh water was rationed and could become stale or contaminated. And illnesses such as dysentery and typhus could easily spread. And in our case, it was smallpox, which claimed the lives of 5 children on that voyage. But by divine providence, none of the ships were lost at sea. And then we arrived at Charlestown in December and placed in quarantine at Sullivan's Island until this scourge passed. But fortunately, our delay was short. And January marked the beginning of a new year of hope. We appeared before the council in Charlestown and presented our applications for eligibility and claiming land through the headright system. It was a rather cumbersome legal process, mind you, but necessary to establish our claims. Once our petitions were approved, we were issued land warrants authorizing the land to be surveyed. And once the surveys were approved, we received our formal patents with the requirement that we pay a small fee to pay for the surveys. We also learned that we had to pay an annual quit rent owed to the colonial government. But despite these delays and unexpected expenses, we were fortunate because we learned that the British Board of Trade had begun restricting these grants. And so we took this as a sign that by his divine hand, God was with us, even though we did not all settle together in the same area. Most of us settled in the wide swaths of land scattered throughout Craven County in the Camden District. and in the lower part of the 96th district. But as a whole, we were content. From our perspective, we owned that land despite the quit rents. And as for me, we received 400 acres of land in the Rocky Creek neighborhood, not far from my new church, Catholic Presbyterian. My wife Jeanette, daughter Nancy, and I were indeed blessed, and all of us in the congregation were blessed. Thanks be to God. Indeed, we were newcomers. Many families with Ulster roots had settled in the area 20 years prior, and we were blessed to receive their assistance. Some had migrated down the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia to escape the Indian troubles during the war with the French and the Indians. They settled in the Waxhaws and the Rocky Creek neighborhood. Our closest neighbors were the McCushton and McDill families. David McCushton and Thomas McDill had served as elders in my congregation back in Ireland, and they assisted me in my first communion at Catholic. I also served as a supply pastor to the meeting house at Jackson's Creek in the Fairfield district, and I was reunited with old friends from Ireland who had settled there as well. Now, Catholic Presbyterian was truly a meeting house in the truest sense of the word. It was not a Catholic church, mind you. There were no Catholic papists in a Presbyterian church. Catholic Presbyterian was a union church, small c Catholic. And it was a union church for the various sects of the Presbyterian faith. A meeting house for old lights, new lights, seceders, burghers, anti-burghers, Covenanters, and later Associate Reformed. But over time, it grew apparent that we needed our own church for us, the Covenanters. So I served at Catholic for about a year, and then we decided to break off and establish our own meeting house just 2 miles away. It was called the Edgar Meeting House. It was located on a beautiful ridge. I can still see the men felling the trees, shaping the timbers with their broad axes, and placing the timbers one by one on top of each other. Our own temple of worship in the wilderness. And we were far and away from Ireland, and far away enough from those colonial authorities at Charlestown.